I'm so proud of being part of our community. And we work hard for giving the community that we're part of all the outreach we can. So I just want to remind you that there are a variety of places that are available to all of you while we get ready for next year. One of them is a Flandre Planetarium, which has a brand new show, which is digital, and it's terrific. The second place is the Mirror Lab. We make the biggest mirrors in the world to make the biggest telescopes in the world. And if any of you would like to visit the Mirror Lab, I urge you to do that. The Mount Lemmon Science Center, you can go up to Mount Lemmon. There's even an app you can use as you drive up the Catalina Mountains. And you can be up and make believe you're an astronomer for the night. Just make sure you bring really warm clothes. The Tree Ring Lab, we invented the tree ring research, and we have a beautiful building which inside of it you have a variety of artifacts showing you how tree rings are used for global climate change, for archaeology. It's truly a terrific experience. And the Desert Lab, where modern ecology was probably invented. Many of you may actually march up and down the hill. We just paved the road, by the way, so you don't break your ankles on your way up there. And finally, the Biosphere 2, the largest ecological apparatus in the world to do research on the oceans, on water, and on the rainforest. And we also have a variety of cafes. These, unfortunately, are all ending, but if any of you are interested in these cafes, they're all over town. They usually have a theme. They have beer, which is one thing that we don't have in here. But usually there's not enough room. So I invite you and I urge you all to think about the science cafes. And finally, we do have a new website. And this website has all of the lecture series that we've created since day one. You should be all proud that in YouTube, we have about 400,000 hits for the last few years. But every single lecture series can be downloaded, you can hear it. If you live in a community which has enough people, just give me a call and maybe we'll leave, and you want to have like parties and have all your community listen to these things. We may be able to get a postdoc or a PhD student to go there and answer questions at the end. I may even show up if the food is good enough. Finally, I'd like to thank all of the folks that have given the money to make this possible. This is not a cheap or easy endeavor to do. TEP has been with us since day one, and research, our VP for research at the university, they're the lead sponsors. But in the next page, you'll see all of those that have been with us for many years, believing in what we do. And I thank all of you, and I thank all of you from our community for the funds that you invest in this enterprise. It does take a village to create something of this magnitude. These are just some of the folks that I want to call out right now. You've already heard from John Pollard, who has the program with our community teachers. And I'd just like to point out Carl Philibaum, which is hiding in the back there. Wave, Carl. He's a member of our community. He's volunteered to do this. But all of the beautiful imagery that you see before we start the lecture series, he actually puts together for all of us. Centennial Hall and the staff in the College of Science that takes part of their time to make sure that this works out okay. And the Arizona Public Media that makes sure that the podcasts are of the best quality. Thank you all for all you do. And the next one too is there's a whole committee that actually also looks at this. And this committee does a variety of things. They come up with the idea of what the lecture series should be. They vet how it should all operate. And in the end, it also sits down with the lecturers and listens to them before the lecture is actually introduced to all of you. So if you pay me enough, I'll show you the tapes that we have to throw away from those original lectures. But in this particular slide, I do want to point out Ken Godat from Godat Design. And the fact that you can actually read these beautiful slides from all these lectures is his doing. He is absolutely terrific. Thank you, Ken. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce Anna Dornhaus. Anna, it comes to us via Germany and then Bristol. She's amazing. She's been at this, she's been giving these lectures. I think this is the 4th time that she's given a lecture to all of us. She's one of those individuals that not only is extraordinary in her science has been in the New York Times, it's been in BBC, but she also has a way with students. So she has had she's mentored about 150 undergraduate students, and each one of those has actually had a poster session or some presentation or some article that has come out. Quite an achievement. Of her 14 PhD and postdoc students, 10 of them have faculty positions in other universities. So she's clearly a powerhouse that not only does research of the highest quality, but is able to transmit her energy and her smarts to those that are around her, undergraduate or graduate students. So please help me welcome Anna Dornhaus.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So I want to talk today about how the mind works and how does science find anything out about it. Now, the difficult thing about the mind is that we can't actually see its workings directly. It's sort of a black box or a gray circle. We can't measure directly what's inside of it. And this is one of the superpowers of science, that we can study things that we can't observe directly. This is like the black holes or the dark matter that Ferial talked about in the talk about our universe. It's like microbes that we can't culture, which Donata talked about in her talk about the microbes in our gut. So like many things that science studies, there's a world of unseen processes in our mind, and I want to talk about how we study them. Now, maybe what you were imagining is that I would talk about neuroscience and somehow how the brain works in a more technical manner. And after all, we have neuroscience, and we can directly measure something about how neurons work. But the problem with neuroscience is that it's still, and the neuroscientists in the audience will forgive me for saying this, in some ways it's in its infancy. Because, for example, the wonderful lecture that we had last week by Kati Gotthard, we suddenly understand something now about how the brain, our brain in our head, and the brain that's in our heart, the nervous system of our heart, are actually communicating with each other. And that's a wonderful insight. And the insight is also that the communication goes both ways. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know what they're talking about. We don't know what the brain and the heart are actually saying to each other. So our understanding via neuroscience of what happens inside this mind is quite incomplete. And so, therefore, the thing that science has to do here is called inference. We have to study the things that go into the mind and the things that come out, which in the case of the mind is the behavior. So like when Ferial talks about studying dark matter, what we're really studying is how this thing that we want to know something about influences other things. We can't study this directly, but we study it by studying its effects on something else. So this is what's called inference. And this is what science enables us to do. So what I'm saying here is that the study of the mind is really the study of behavior. And one of my favorite books for the public about animal behavior is actually called The Other End of the Leash. It's sort of a book about dogs, but actually it's more a book about humans. It's about how our relationship with dogs is really affected by our own evolutionary history more than their evolutionary history. It's affected by our own experiences as much as their experiences. So if you want to understand dogs and our relationship with dogs, really what you have to understand is humans. So the human is the thing at the other end of the leash. And I want to give you an example. So here's this woman who loves her dog, and she's hugging it. And her experience of this event as a wonderful social bonding event is shaped by her own personal and evolutionary history. It's shaped by the fact that primates like to hug each other a lot. Here's some chimpanzees hugging. Maybe it's a grandparent and a child chimpanzee. But generally, primates like to touch each other's hands. They like to touch each other's bodies. They like to apply pressure. We heard last time, too, that primates like to groom each other. They like to have a lot of body contact. And the fact of the matter is that evolutionary history is not shared with the other individual in this picture. So the other individual in this picture, maybe he's thinking that, or maybe through torturous experience he's become used to the fact that this does not predict anything horrible happening. But one way or another, whatever experience this woman is having is shaped by her, by context, by her context, by things that are not inside this local situation. So although she maybe thinks of this as bonding experience, this perception is not actually shaped by what's happening right now. It's shaped by her history. And his perception of what's happening right now is shaped by his history. And this is why it's so difficult to understand somebody else's mind. And so when one of them is a person, the other one is a dog, we think of this as anthropomorphism. We think others must think like us. She thinks the dog must enjoy this as much as she does. But really what this is self-morphism, because we always think other people, other individuals of any kind, must interpret the situation like we interpret it. We find it very hard to believe that somebody could not see that this is a loving social interaction. But when you come to the same situation with a different background, if you're from Mars, or if you're a dog, you have a completely different understanding of what's going on. You come with different baggage, and therefore the local situation seems different. And this is one of the reasons we have so hard time understanding each other. So in this case, we are using inference, but wrongly, right? This woman is thinking that the dog is thinking something positive, and she has a false certainty about it because she can't imagine that somebody else might not come to the situation with the same background. And science does something to get us out of that false certainty, unfortunately, or fortunately, into hopefully a more correct understanding, but often with more uncertainty attached. So while scientists are searching for certainty, what they often find is uncertainty. We already heard about that in the first lecture. And so this, I want to argue that really if you are willing to engage with science, if you really want to use all the benefits that science can provide, you have to accept that there's these two things about science that are incredibly uncomfortable. One of them is that you have to accept a certain degree of humility. And nobody likes humility. I don't like humility. I'm sure you guys don't like humility. Nobody likes being wrong. Nobody likes other people thinking that they're wrong. But that is what science is about. Science is, you maybe think that scientists are people that walk around on stages and, they like being right in front of other people. And that may all be true, but fundamentally, scientists are willing to be wrong about stuff. And that's not true for all people, but that is a critical element. And the other critical element is not only may you be wrong about stuff, but also you may not be certain about the stuff that you write about. So you have to accept that all knowledge comes with some uncertainty. And this is also a core element of science, but it's also very uncomfortable. Like Joanna said in the first lecture, it's just uncomfortable to accept uncertainty. So having made you somewhat uncertain, I now want to tell you what I believe the basic two principles are that really make science science and that really help us break through these prejudices, break through our own context, our own evolutionary or otherwise history of that colors everything that we see and everything that we interpret. So sticking with dogs, let's imagine we want to answer why does a dog wag its tail? And most of you probably think you know the answer why a dog wags its tail. There's this bumper sticker here, wag more, bark less, which of course is meant to say dogs wag their tail when they're happy. We should all be happy. But so the first principle that science requires of us is that we accept alternatives, right? This is the humility part. We accept that actually something else might be true. We might be wrong about this interpretation that we already have. So I made up some arbitrary alternatives here. But we could make, if we were doing this for real as a science study, we would make up more alternatives. We would, in fact, try to come up with all the alternatives. Okay, let's say the possibilities are dogs wag their tail when they're happy, dogs wag their tail when they're tense, dogs wag their tail when they're sad. Impossible, you say. Well, the second principle is that you should think about what are the concrete predictions that these things make, these alternative hypotheses, these alternative answers. What would we predict about the world or about the dog's behavior if each of them was true? Here are some everyday or semi-everyday occurrences that might be relevant for dogs. And so making predictions, what that means is we think about, well, if wagging your tail means that you're happy, would you wag your tail if you're eating a bone? Yes, you would, because dogs like eating bones. It makes them happy. Certainly my dog's very happy about this. Assuming the bone is being consumed in a quiet place with no disturbances and nobody's about to take it away, no reason to be tense about it, no reason to be sad. So the dog would not wag its tail if this is tail wagging, but it would if it was happiness. On the other hand, meeting a new dog, certainly when you have adult dogs, most adult dogs don't really like meeting other dogs. No reason to be happy there, but you might be a little tense because you don't know if they're friendly or not. But you're probably not sad about meeting a new dog either, so no tail wagging there. So these are our predictions. And you can argue with the details of these predictions, but the key is that you make the predictions before you actually know what's going to happen. Of course, now we don't have a dog to demonstrate, so we're just going to do this as a thought experiment. But most of you who have dogs will probably think that this is likely to be an outcome. So after we made the predictions, we then look at when do dogs, in fact, wag their tails. Well, most dogs wag their tails a lot when they meet new dogs. And most dogs don't wag their tails when they're just sitting there eating a bone. Okay, if that is our observation, now we compare it to our predictions. And this is the key here. We made the predictions before thinking about when do dogs, in fact, wag their tails. And, well, in this case, it happens that tense is the thing that correctly predicted that there would be no wagging here and wagging there. So this is the explanation. This is the answer to when do dogs wag their tails. It's about a tense emotion, not a happy or sad emotion. Now, most people think that dogs are happy when they wag their tails. How did they come to this? Why did they think this? Well, I think most people think this because the primary occasion when people see the dog wagging its tail is when they come home. And this is one of the best things about having a dog. You come home, somebody is happy to see you. And so you really don't want to believe that the dog is anything but happy when you do come home. So really, if this is tail wagging, right, it's sort of a circular argument, but it's very hard to convince ourselves that this is not absolute happiness. Now, I don't want to say that the dog is not happy, but for the dog, you coming home is a bit like meeting with the boss. So yes, I like meeting with the boss. It could be productive conversation. Maybe I'm trying to get something from him. But it's also a little nerve-wracking. So maybe you're not unhappy, but you certainly are also a little bit tense. So happy and tense both predict that the dog would be wagging here. And sad, I'm not sad when I meet with my boss anyway, and maybe the dog isn't either. So why does the dog wag its tail? Again, tense correctly predicted every situation in which the dog would be wagging. And the key thing here is that you're not allowed to make any excuses now. You're not allowed to say, well, you don't really know anything about dog happiness. If you went along with the examples before, you're not allowed to change your mind after the fact, after you know that that you are going to be able to, or be forced to conclude something you don't like. So I think especially so when you're studying the mind, especially in animal behavior, we really don't believe in scientists as geniuses. We believe in scientists as disciplined people. People who are willing to accept a conclusion that the data give you, no matter what it is. If you like it or not, too bad. The point is, you're not allowed to come up with a different explanation in hindsight for why actually this wasn't the right prediction, now that I know when the dog actually wags. Okay, so hopefully having unsettled you with that, getting back to how our mind works, or how minds work in general. So like I said, we have to infer something from the behavior, but we can also introspect and look at our own mind. And when we think about our own mind, I'm going to say we have two main ideas of how our mind works. And intuitively, I'm going to call them irreducible intelligence and rational intelligence. So what do I mean by that? So irreducible intelligence is this idea that really my mind, it's just like a little person is in there, right? There's another person in the brain that keeps talking and deciding things and arguing and has preferences and so on. And there's many cartoons and there's even neuroscience books, and people, even scientists, talk about this as if the brain was just sort of a shell for another thing, for another person, for an agent inside of there who makes all the decisions. So it can't really be broken down. It's one thing, one agent who does the thinking inside our brain. That's our intuition. And the other intuition is that somehow the way that decision-making works is that we have certain preferences, and as we grow up, we learn about the rules of how the world works. We learn what the consequences are of certain actions, what are the payoffs, or this or that. And then we make decisions based on these rules that we've learned about how the world works and what the values or the payoffs for different outcomes are. And we somehow calculate, therefore, what the best action is. So this is rational intelligence. This is very much about how classical economics works. So that's our other intuition. And what I want to do in this talk is talk about how these two interpretations of how our mind works hold up to scientific scrutiny. And these are so ingrained in our perception of how our mind works that I first want to start by talking about whether it's even possible to be wrong about this. It seems like it's not really possible to be wrong about this because I can experience the thing in my head talking. And I believe that I'm rational and, making decisions based on preferences and stuff like that. So first I want to talk about if it's possible to be wrong, and then what are the alternatives? What can we even think? Can we even conceive of another mode or another way of operating? And of course, I wouldn't say this if I didn't think there was an alternative. So I'm going to argue that instead of this irreducible agent in our brain, we have to get used to the counterintuitive and uncomfortable idea of distributed cognition, not unified, but in separate locations. And instead of rationality, we have to get used to this mode of operating that's based on examples and heuristics. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But that's just a preview of what I'm going to say. So, irreducible intelligence, rational intelligence. Now, like I said, we find it hard to believe that we could be wrong about this because we think that we can see our own mind, right? We say that even. I know my own mind. I think, therefore I am, and I'm analyzing my thinking, and that tells me something about how my mind works. But actually, decades of research in psychology and behavioral economics and other disciplines have shown that this is totally wrong. This is an illusion. Everything you think you know about how your brain works is an illusion. Your own introspection, your views on why you made the decision to come here tonight, all of those are illusions. So these are just two quotes from a review that's already 40 years old. There's little or no direct introspective access to higher order cognitive processes. What that means is you can't look inside yourself and see how your cognition, your intelligence worked. And the other one there, only 10 years old. In short, introspection is often not a valid and reliable method for assessing the self. So there you have it. Famous psychologists, they're reviewing a broad literature and they're saying this is an illusion. Introspection doesn't work. But I want to give you a more gut feeling for this. So this is an example. This is a study that I like that illustrates this. So here's some researchers, and they built up a little stand in front of a supermarket. And in that stand in front of the supermarket, they said to the people passing by, here we have some jam samples. Do you want to try some jam? And so let's say you're my test subject. Here we have this jam, and it's not labeled, so the labels are just there so you know what it is since you can't actually taste it. And then we have that jam. And so you get a spoonful of that, and then you get a spoonful of that. And which one do you like better? This one. Okay, so he likes this one better. So then I'm giving him a spoonful of that one out of this jar. And I say, well, why do you like this? And what he's going to do, in all likelihood, so he's going to have said that he liked the apple jam, and I'm giving him grapefruit jam, pretending that it's just another serving of apple jam, and I say, why do you like this? And he's going to say, well, I really like the fresh tartness of the grapefruit in this jam. So this is quite fascinating, right? And so some of you are staring at me, not quite knowing if I said what I said. So the point is, 80 to 90% of people will not notice that I gave them the wrong jam, because the researchers have these two jars, apple jam, grapefruit jam, and then they after they've given you, a spoonful of one, spoonful of the other, they surreptitiously turn them over, and in the other half, they actually have the other jam. And so, you said you like this one better, so I'm giving you another spoonful of this one, but because I turn it around, I'm actually giving you the other jam. Only 10% of people notice that something is wrong here. That's quite amazing, but what's more amazing is these other 90% of people, or 80 to 90% of people, are able to give a detailed explanation why they so liked this jam. So this is called choice blindness, this phenomenon. It means they really actually forgot what it was that they chose. And they just come up in hindsight with some explanation why they liked the thing that I told them that they liked, that they believed that they liked a minute before. And there is a wealth of studies in psychology and behavioral economics that show the same thing. Choice affects preference, timing of decisions. There are so many studies that all show. In fact, Kati talked about priming, so she talked about the fact that we come up with reasons why the person we interviewed was really rigid or quite flexible, and we as the experimenter know it was because they sat in a hard chair or not. It had nothing to do with the actual person, but of course the interviewer themselves think it's all based on the interaction with the person. So it's like the jam. They made up an explanation for why they came to the conclusion that they came to, not knowing why they actually came to that conclusion. This is called the Introspection Illusion. And because it's easy to do, and because I want to convince you that illusions are a real thing, here's an optical illusion. You probably all have seen optical illusions. And the point here is, this is a real person, my friend Nick. He's holding a real object. The real object and his hand are seen in a mirror. And you can watch this video 100 times, and you will not be able to convince your brain that what he's holding is not, 4 rings connected and a star is over here. And then he's turning it, and it's a star here and 4 rings there. And your mind just will not process the fact that it's the same thing. And the introspection illusion is the same. The introspection illusion is that we are so convinced, we can go to any number of science talks about how the mind works, but our own introspection is so convincing and yet so wrong about how our mind actually works, how we actually make choices. I'll show you a still picture of this later. So, but anyone want to see it again? Quite fascinating. The illusion is developed by this mathematician who has a whole series of illusions of things that look different in the mirror than what they look like not in the mirror. So it all depends on the viewing angle. Anyway, you can Google this afterwards. Okay. So this was to convince you that our intuitive understanding of how our mind works may not actually be correct. Now, what is the correct thing? So I want to dissect first this irreducible intelligence perception, and then the rational intelligence. So irreducible intelligence is actually quite weird, right? So if you think that the intelligence is really like a little mind inside, like a little agent inside my mind, the question is, what is that agent made up of? Does he have a brain inside of him that has a little person inside of him or her? And also, it's hard to know who has it and who doesn't have it. What is the outside sign of having a little person inside your mind? Does this thing have something in his mind? If I drop it and it falls down, did it make a decision to fall down? Or the computer over there, did it decide to show the slide? We usually will shrug this off as being implausible nonsense. But what about an ant? Or what about something that has a minute little brain? So we tend to think of a large swath of the world as being things that have either no brain at all or a small brain, but they have genetically fixed instincts. This thing cannot help but fall down if I let it go. There's no decision-making involved. And we think of simple animals the same way. We think of them as little machines that have this stimulus response rule schematic somewhere inside of them, and they always react the same way. And we think of ourselves instead as having all these other more sophisticated intellectual abilities. Now, here's some ants that certainly look like a mass of faceless, instinct-driven workers. But when you look at ants individually, here's a picture from the New York Times article, but on my website you can see this in color, so we color the ants with different color codes, and we find out that individual ants have individual personalities. Every ant acts differently. Every ant does not behave in the same way when you prod it with the same things. So each ant is its own individual. That's also true for each bee. So this is an older study that I was involved in during my PhD. Bees can be fast and sloppy or slow and accurate. So some bees like to really look very careful at something that's presented to them, and some like to just get done with the job fast, even if they make a lot of errors. And then recently in my lab, Nicolas Di Renzo has developed a whole system with black widow spiders, and they also have individual personalities, and they show that not just in their behavior, but also in their webs. So here's 2 black widow webs from 2 different spiders, and this spider here is pretty bold, and this one's pretty risk-averse. And how can we tell that? Because this one put most of its silk into these what's called gum-footed lines that are there to ensnare prey, whereas this spider only has a few gum-footed lines and instead puts most of its silk into a structure that can protect the spider instead of being focused on collecting food. So this is what these gum-footed lines look like. They have little glue drops on them, and they trap ants and things on the bottom. Here's Nick. So, and then final example for that same point, I've currently been working with several elementary schools in Tucson, and second grade kids, in this case from Hendrix, can easily show that crickets have different personalities. In this experiment, they were measuring how often does the cricket hide in a shelter or not. So here's the super bold ones that are always outside, and here's the crickets that are super shy and always hiding. So even in crickets, it is easy to show that each individual has different behavior, consistently different reactions to the same situation. I'm going to go fairly fast through the rest of the list because I've talked about some of these examples before in previous lectures, but Nikki Clayton showed that jays, for example, have episodic memory. They can understand some story of events that happened to them. The mirror test is a test that was once believed to show self-awareness or sort of a higher cognitive ability about knowing about yourself. And it's true that everybody agrees that apes have passed the mirror test in that when you show them a mirror and you anesthetize them, you put a little paint mark on the chimp, and then they wake up and you show them the mirror, they look at the mirror and they scratch their own face rather than trying to touch the monkey with the strange mark on its face, right? So they have some understanding that they're looking at themselves. Now, recently, somebody has claimed that an ant has passed the mirror test. And I tried to find some criticism of the study, and the only criticism I could find was that they didn't describe their methods in sufficient detail, which is fair enough. But the point is, the mirror test, once thought to be the hallmark of higher intelligence, now has been passed, or at least claimed to be passed, by a whole bunch of different animals. Metacognition is the idea that you know what you know, or you learn when it's worth learning anything. And studies by Amy Dunlap in my lab, for example, show that bees can learn how fast the environment changes and decide whether to learn something based on that. So here's a bee going through a maze where it has to make repeated decisions between blue and yellow. And bees learn how fast the environment changes and whether it's worth trying to learn anything about it. If it changes too fast, it's not worth trying to learn anything. And equally or similarly, bees can learn whether other bees are reliable or whether colors are reliable indicators of reward, and then they learn whichever one is the reliable thing. So bees are actually quite flexible in deciding what kind of things to learn. And here's another study by Cindy Way and Fred Dyer from Michigan, and they showed that bees also know whether they know the way home, and when they realize they don't know the way home, they do a special orientation flight where they learn all the stimuli and what their hive environment looks like. So all of these are evidence that bees, to some degree, know what they know. You've, of course, heard of different cases of symbolic communication in animals. I wanted to show this picture in particular because This is actually a grad student. This is her professor. And the professor essentially encouraged the grad student to take this little chimp and raise him in her family as a child. So she invested about a decade or so into this. If you have any little children, you can imagine that this is quite a commitment to graduate school on her part. Anyway, the chimp study showed that this is a few decades ago, and a lot of the study is controversial, but what's not controversial is that chimps can learn a series of symbols, human symbols, so sign language or signs on a keyboard, and use that as a sort of language. It's not quite like human language because the vocabulary is not that great, nor is the grammar as sophisticated. But they can use symbolic communication, and more recent studies have shown that also dolphins can use their click signals as symbolic communication. They appear to have something like names by which they can recognize other dolphins. And then vervet monkeys have also been shown to use different acoustic signals signifying different kinds of predators, for example, a snake versus a hawk or other aerial predator. So we have symbolic communication, and we have teaching and social learning and goal-directed behavior, so there's nothing more goal-directed than soccer. Here are bumblebees playing soccer. What are they doing, you might say? There's not 22 bumblebees on this field. Yes, there is not, and in fact, they don't know all the rules of soccer, but they are trying to get the ball in the goal. And what's really interesting about this study is the best way to teach a bumblebee how to play soccer is to pretend to be a bumblebee and show her how soccer works. So what the researchers actually did was they made a little clay bumblebee, right? That's what you see here, and they showed this naive bumblebee what happens when you put a ball in the goal, which is namely that you get sugar water. So what's so fascinating about this is that really bees and many other animals learn a lot better from other animals of the same species rather than from their own experience. So social learning and teaching, also once thought to be uniquely human attributes, are actually quite commonplace in animals and certainly in bees. Okay, and whoops, I skipped over this. Until Jane Goodall came around in the 60s, it was also widely believed that tool-making in use was unique to humans. These are chimpanzee-made stone tools, not human-made ones. So tool-making in use has now been widely shown, including in birds and other species. Manipulating your environment for your own good is widespread in animals and social insects in particular. This is actually a concrete cast of a very large ant nest, a leaf-cutting ant nest in South America. So they just poured concrete into the entrance of the ant nest, and then they excavated it. And you can see the fungus-growing chambers, you can see tunnels, you can see people for scale. So you can see how big this undertaking is from the point of view of an ant. And it turns out bees can have different emotional states, and I don't mean that without exaggeration. So, for example, optimism and pessimism are usually defined as interpreting an ambiguous stimulus or an ambiguous situation either in a favorable or unfavorable way. So it's like the glass is half full or half empty, right? The glass is half full and half empty, but which interpretation do you focus on? Well, it turns out bees that you put in a jar and shake for 60 seconds, if you then give them an ambiguous stimulus, so the bees know that this is good and this is bad, but you give them something that's in between, so it's ambiguous, the bees that you shook are going to choose to interpret it in a pessimistic way, namely everything that is even remotely similar to this is bad, whereas the bees that are undisturbed interpret it in an optimistic way, namely everything that's even remotely similar to the good thing is good. So this has been argued to show that bees and other animals also show optimism and pessimism and maybe other emotions. So irreducible intelligence has problems. So first of all, we don't have an operational definition. We don't have a qualitative, measurable thing by which we can tell if somebody has that me inside the brain, which leaves us with the conclusion that maybe everyone and everything has one of those. We also have an unbroken line of heritage with every one of those animals that I just mentioned. In the case of this picture, my unbroken line of heritage is very short with one individual and slightly longer with the other individual. But nevertheless, there is a direct genetic connection. There is a line of ancestry that connects us to, connects all of you to each of these guys here. And so where and how did intelligence actually originate? in that line of ancestry. This irreducible intelligence view does not give us an answer because you either have it or you don't have it. And finally, our brain is actually a network of neurons. We know that from neuroscience. There's no hidden person in there. Science has not found a connection to some non-material mind somewhere in this brain. So how does intelligence actually emerge from the thing that we materially know is there? And what I'm arguing here is the alternative is really distributed cognition. Distributed cognition is the idea that intelligence can actually emerge from lots of individually non-intelligent things, like neurons, or maybe lots of individually non-intelligent ants. So in this example, there's a little Cheerio, and the ants are transporting the Cheerio towards the nest that's over here on this side. But each ant that's actually actively pulling the Cheerio cannot see where it's going because it's holding the Cheerio in front of its face. So the only way that it can go in the right direction is because these new ants that are coming that still know where the nest is, in the moment where they attach, they still remember because they were just unattached, so they remember which one the nest is. So the ants that are carrying the Cheerio allow each new ant to determine the direction. And then after a few seconds, that ant really has forgotten which way it's going and doesn't know it anymore, but then a new ant attaches. So there are these transient leaders that pull the Cheerio just that little bit into the right direction in the moment where they attach. So this is an example of distributed cognition where an overall problem-solving goal, namely moving towards the nest, is achieved without the individuals participating in it, each individual only contributing in a minute amount to that goal. So overall, distributed cognition argues that just like in an ant colony in the brain, the neurons interact in a way that allow us to make decisions without every neuron having intelligence. And we actually showed formally that the decision-making that ant colonies make when they choose between different nest sites is exactly the same process by which neurons in visual perception in your visual cortex decide which way things are moving in your visual field. So there are definitely similarities there. However, it is incredibly hard to convince yourself that it's possible to build up an intelligence like yours from these disconnected nerve cells, these disconnected ants that are somehow doing their own unintelligent thing. But I'm just reminding you here of this optical illusion. If you look at the left picture, even if you completely intellectually accept that the right picture is showing just a few seconds later of the same video, it is almost impossible to convince yourself that this is the same object, right? Nobody believes that. You can sort of believe it, but you'll look at it and you'll immediately forget that that's what I said. Okay, what about rationality? So rationality is like playing chess. You know what the moves are, what the allowed moves are in chess, what each piece can do. You know the value of different positions and different outcomes. And so therefore you can somehow calculate the optimal strategy. That's what we imagine rationality is. And that is what most parents imagine. We just repeat over and over. The rule is you have your hand underneath the goat feet so it doesn't fall down and jump in your face. And you repeat the consequences. If you don't listen to me this time, you never get to touch another goat again, and it doesn't work. Or in classical economics, right? Economists think that we make decisions based on our utility function, and that utility function might be complicated, but it's determined by those preferences we have. We either like grapefruit jam or we don't like it, right? That is what economics is built on. And it turns out in practical life, both of these approaches fail. You can repeat the rules any number of times, it doesn't really work, and classical economics is not very good at predicting the actions of actual individual people when they're buying houses or jams or anything else. So what is the alternative here? What is another kind of intelligence? And here I think we can learn something from artificial intelligence, which is what last year's lecture series was about. We have a history of trying to build intelligence from scratch in a computer. And in the last few decades, we have actually achieved quite a lot with artificial intelligence. We've mastered chess and Go. A computer has won a quiz show, and now we're working on those on the right there. And computers are getting, or programmers software engineers are getting better and better at figuring out how to solve these problems. But there's an important insight that the artificial intelligence community has reached that I think the general public has not quite absorbed, which is that we started out in artificial intelligence exactly with that view of intelligence that I told you we all have, that intelligence is kind of like playing chess, that you just have to know the rules, and you just have to figure out what is the value of each outcome. And if you know the rules and you know the values of each outcome, then you can somehow calculate how to find the best strategy. And that is how intelligence researchers initially tried to build intelligence, and it just didn't work for a long time. And it progressed extremely slowly. And we moved to a totally different model of how we can construct artificial intelligence. And this different model is basically learning from data, learning from examples. We now call that essentially machine learning. So I want to briefly review what machine learning is. Like I said, this was also discussed in the last lecture series last year. For example, in machine learning, if we want to decide if something is a cat or a dog, we start with a bunch of examples where you know whether they are cats or dogs. So we know these are cats and we know these are dogs. And then we try to measure a whole bunch of things about them, properties, traits, features, whatever you call it, and we arrange these different examples on axes according to their features. Maybe this axis is how pointy the ears are, or how long the legs are, or some other feature of these items. And then we try to see, well, if all the cats are over here and all the dogs are over here, and now I stop caring what these axes actually are, but somehow all the cat examples that I know of seem to cluster together, and all the dog examples I know of seem to cluster together as well. And so now what the machine has to do is just draw a line between these two groups of points, and then every new example that I have where I have to decide is it a cat or a dog, well, if it's on this side of the line, it's a dog. If it's on the other side of the line with a yellow point, it's a cat. That is how machine learning works. I don't want to say that there's no sophistication to it at all, but the essential mechanism is that we don't have to know in advance what the difference between cats and dogs is. All we have to have is lots of examples of cats and lots of examples of dogs, and then we can draw a line between them. And if we have more examples, maybe it turns out the line is more complicated, right? And there is still uncertainty. There are still errors that are being made. For example, there's that yellow little dot on the right. That's a cat that apparently looks like dogs in a lot of ways. But that's okay. So both artificial and real intelligence makes mistakes. But overall, this is an incredibly powerful method, and it's really the method that has led to the advances in artificial intelligence we've seen in the last couple of decades. Okay, so it's really a fairly simple procedure. So just to contrast these two approaches again, rational intelligence is the idea that we decide a strategy based on known rules and the values of the outcomes that result from the different decisions. Whereas this example-based decision-making that also is similar to machine learning does not care about rules. It doesn't care about calculating the value of different outcomes or deriving anything mathematically. It just tries to see how similar is it to previous examples that I've seen. And I'm just going to group it with whatever group of examples it's most similar to. Now, the key here is to understand that this only works given a particular environment. So this, of course, in the cat and dog example, we needed all those previous examples of cats and dogs. So it does depend on having that rich assortment of examples to begin with. And it also depends on being in that environment where those examples are the relevant examples. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So what concrete predictions do these two views make? If our brain works like this or our brain works like that, what would we see happen? Well, one example is, if you decide what is a bird, if you're operating by rational intelligence, all you need is a definition. So a bird is something with a beak and feathers. That's a pretty good definition for a bird. If you're deciding that based on example-based decision-making, then maybe these are some examples of things that you know are birds. And so any animal that looks a lot like that is going to be classified as a bird. That's how you're going to operate, if that is how your brain operates. Now, what happens if you have a new thing and you're trying to decide, well, is this a bird or not? Well, if you're deciding based on beak and feathers, it has a beak, it has feathers, it should be pretty obvious, right? It shouldn't be any harder than any other bird because the beak and the feathers are quite clearly there. But it doesn't look like those examples of birds that you knew at all, right? And so because it's so outside of that realm of examples, if that is how you operate, if you operate based on example-based decision-making, you should have a lot of trouble classifying this thing. So here's our graph again from the machine learning. It's sort of like this. If the birds are the purple ones down here and the green ones are things that are not birds, and now you have a new thing that's outside of the realm of examples that you already know, you really can't classify it, or you're going to make a lot of mistakes classifying things. And it turns out atypical examples take a lot longer to classify. So it both takes kids longer to learn that an ostrich is in fact a bird, even when they're quite good at identifying other birds. And even you as an adult will take longer if you're shown a picture of an ostrich to decide whether or not it's a bird, even if you eventually come to the correct conclusion. So it turns out that this example-based decision-making is better at predicting what happens when you're trying to classify an ostrich than the rational intelligence is. And this goes for many other examples. The other problem with rational intelligence is, in many cases, it's not easy to actually write down that definition. The idea that you can define everything with a simple rule like a bird is something with a beak and feathers just doesn't quite work for a lot of things. It's much easier to classify a chair based on the fact that it looks like a lot of other chairs you've seen before than it is to actually write down what the definition of a chair is. And this is true for many everyday decisions. So to summarize, instead of this intuitive concept of our mind working as irreducible intelligence and rational intelligence, as something that is a unit, a me inside my brain that makes decisions, and these decisions are made based on rules and calculating the value of different outcomes, those two concepts really don't agree that well with what we now know about how decisions are actually made, or our evolutionary history, or trying to explain how the brain works and how the brain could have emerged from earlier brains. So instead, I think that current psychology, behavior science, biology, evolutionary biology all agree that we must have something that is more distributed. Intelligence must emerge from a distributed network where each individual unit is not intelligent. And quite frequently, if not always, it must be based on this example-based decision-making, because that can solve a lot of everyday situations and predict better how we act in everyday situations. And just to give you a few more examples so you don't think it's just about identifying birds or cats or dogs, imagine you're driving to work every day the same way, but one time you have an appointment across town. How often does it happen that you're just driving to your regular workplace and when you get there you realize that this was not where you meant to go at all? And why does this happen? It happens because when you start driving, you don't actually have a map in your brain that tells you where you are and where you're going to be at every point and where you're going. You sort of have this example-based decision-making where, okay, I'm in the corner of Grant and Swan, and here's where I always turn right. And so you have this thing in your brain where every situation triggers the next situation just based on the examples that you've done it a million times. Or if you ever travel to Germany, so I'm from Germany. When I first moved here, at parties it would always happen that there would be somebody I'm having a conversation with, and they would be standing quite far away, and so I would go a little closer, and I'd be listening to their conversation, and they would step away. And then I would go a little closer, and they would step away, and eventually it would rise to my consciousness that there was something weird going on. Well, and it turns out this is not a rule that we learn. This is not a rule that anybody had ever articulated to me. But in Germany, the normal conversation distance is maybe from here to there. And in the States, the normal conversation distance is more like to there. And then if you travel to India, it's more like to here. And these are the rules that we have internalized by lots of examples. We don't ever actually get taught any explicit rules, and we're not aware of them. And this is also true in language learning and many other domains, where we have lots of examples that we train over and over, and we behave well in situations that are similar to those examples, and we behave badly once we get outside of the realm of examples that we've already learned about. So what I would like to argue is that what science is a search for our own, that the search for certainty is also a search for our own misconceptions. It's easy to have a false certainty, but what we really want is not false certainty. We would rather accept uncertainty. We want to find our own misconceptions. And as we learned in this lecture series, science can be about discovery. It can be about going to the Antarctic or other places. Science could be about debate, about people disagreeing. Science could be about lots of data, 50,000 data points from robot floats all over the world. Science could be about models, mathematical descriptions of the universe. Science could be about statistics and figuring out what the probability is in a randomized trial that you get a certain outcome. All of these are important components of science. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think any of those define science. You can get all of those things outside of science. Explorers discover things. People collect data. Just having data doesn't make it science, nor does having statistics. I think that science is really defined by its ability to contradict our previous view, to shake us out of our comfort zone, to contradict the thing that we've already accepted. But science can only do that if we actually let it. So I would like to argue with each of you, let that bit of rationality win out. Let science actually contradict what you believe, and that will make you smarter than bees. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And if I can ask all of you to stay for a second, please. Thank you so much. I would like to invite all the speakers to come on board here so we can thank them all. Thank you, it was terrific.
Are we doing this?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, these are the public stars, and we've had the best, I think, of all the lecture series ever. But behind all of this is one person that has made all these lecture series as extraordinary as they've been, and that's Bo Baylor, the producer of these. And if I can ask Bo to come up, please. Bo is really the reason that all of this is seamless. Bo is unfortunately finally said she's had enough of all of us, and she's retiring. So I'm not quite sure where we're going to get next year. We'll do our best, but it's hard to believe that it's going to be any better than it's been for the last 12 years. And Bo, where are you? Oh, here you are. This is just a token of appreciation for all you've done for the city of Tucson for all these years. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.